You really need to look hard at yourself and say, am I just trying to build a product because I want it without building a business? My name is Alistair Croll. I've been mentoring startups probably for 20 years now, partly through Startup Fest, which is a conference that I chair in Montreal, Canada, partly through a bunch of startup accelerators, and with Techstars in Toronto, in New York. There was a Techstars Comcast media mentorship. So some virtual, some online for the better part of a decade now. You have a vision, and that vision is necessary because most of the people don't believe you're going to succeed. If everyone believed what you were doing was logical, there'd be no opportunity there. So that vision has to remain, but at the same time, circumstances change dramatically. The cost of launching a startup has probably dropped by a factor of 10 with the advent of cloud computing, and the factor of 10 again with the advent of AI-assisted startups. And so if you are unable to adjust your tactics to the new realities of a business model, you're going to die. So I think the real challenge is to find this kind of yin-yang balance where you're very committed to a vision, but very open to changing how you accomplish that vision. And that's a knife edge that I think every startup founder struggles with almost daily. So I started working in tech very young because I had an Apple II computer with a bulletin board on it. And so I learned the hard way all of the different things that made computers work before there was an internet. And then I got a job in tech as a product manager in the telecom industry. If you ever put one of those AOL CD-ROMs into a computer, the thing that it dialed up was my product. I was the product manager for software that was on 75,000 modems in a data center in Reston, Virginia. That led me to work in bandwidth management for a company called 3Com, which is the company that invented Ethernet. And then I kind of moved from industry to industry. So I started a company called Coradiant. It was one of the first companies in the managed services space, along with companies like LoudCloud. And we pivoted to make a product called TrueSight, which was one of the first real user monitoring companies. And this was a pretty big eye opener because at the time you would test your website and see if it worked by like testing it. Hey, it works for me. And instead we thought it was better to look at what users were experiencing and optimize your website from that. So that got me into like internet performance. From there, I started doing a lot of cloud computing stuff. We sold Coradiant to BMC Software. And then I started running conferences and advising companies. I ran a startup accelerator in Montreal called Year One Labs with 3 of my friends. And out of Year One Labs came a book called Lean Analytics. And that's the thing that most startup founders know me for. Lean Analytics was the book that kind of showed a generation of founders how to use data to build a better business faster. That led into a conference called Strata, which was O'Reilly's big data conference that I chaired for about a decade. And then in 2017, I launched a conference called Forward 50, which has become the world's biggest conference on digital government. Along the way, I've mentored and advised a bunch of different startups, and I've just published a new book called Just Evil Enough, because after 2 decades of talking to founders, I realized the problem is seldom your product. The problem is almost always, how do you make people care, and how do you make the system you're in behave in a way that its creators didn't intend, so you can find an unfair advantage in your go-to-market strategy. One of the big challenges that startup founders face is there's a big difference between being a startup founder and a business operator, because the skills that you need to found a company are very different from the skills you need to build a team, develop a sales strategy. Most founders are expected to learn on the go how to build and scale an organization, hire the right people, all these sort of blocking and tackling rules. So the first thing I think that's neglected is how to go from being a founder to being a master operator. The second thing is that we tend to over-index on product. It's very, very easy to lose yourself in your product. We love designing the product, fixing the UI, tweaking the code, adding just one more feature. The reality is that most startups don't die because they lacked one more feature. They died because they didn't have a good go-to-market strategy. And that's really over the years become the one question I ask startups that they usually can't answer is, what's the one unfair advantage you have? What's the tactic you've thought of that nobody else did that will help you to break free of the pack and acquire users at scale? In other words, how are you going to capture attention and turn it into profitable demand? I think the first thing is to spend as much time developing your go-to-market strategy as you do working on your product. Most people don't spend that kind of balance. The second is really to get out and talk to people. There are so many startup founders who have a vision for a thing existing, but they don't have a vision for the business model that brings that thing into the world and makes it sustainable. If you have a vision for an idea without a business model behind it, that's great, but that's called a hobby. It's not a business. And it's fraud to try and close funding around that with the expectation that investors will make a return on that investment. So you really have to understand that you're not building a product, you're building a startup. So if you don't have a startup idea that is based on something uncertain, that will have a business model that leads to sustainable, repeatable revenue streams, you really need to look hard at yourself and say, am I just trying to build a product because I want it without building a business? So step one is understand the growth ambitions of your business model and secure financing commensurate with that. The second thing, and this is my favorite piece of advice about fundraising, is if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. So get out there and talk to investors long before you need money. Ask them for their advice. Make them a part of your growth. They love to keep their ear to the ground and understand new technologies. And then when you're going out to actually fundraise, it's a combination of your pitch and your outreach strategy. People often think about the pitch. They work on their slides day in, day out. They don't think about how do I take warm leads and have those sometimes awkward conversations about fundraising, and how do I build a list of cold leads with good opening strategies that will get people to consider my message and respond to me. So when it comes to fundraising, once you know what you're trying to raise, work on your pitch, how you deliver it, how you handle questions, but also work on the outreach strategy for those warm and cold leads that are going to fund your deal. There's two big market shifts. I think the first is the rise of micro niches. It used to be that you had to find a certain market segment. Now you can find a tiny, tiny segment with a very specialized product because you can reach 10,000 customers around the world. And if those 10,000 customers are willing to pay you for your product, then you can get to a point where you can start to understand how to expand. So go after a smaller target market than you think you want with a more specific set of needs than you'd like to build. That's the first thing. Second thing is, we live in an era of 3-word political strategies. Emily and I in Just Evil Enough have this line that's, if you don't feel your message is too simple, it's not simple enough. You have to be comfortable with oversimplifying everything and making your product the obvious or easy choice. So I think really simple messaging, sadly, that's where we are as a society. I think understanding micro niches, and then figuring out how to target a market that might seem too small for the big competitors to worry about and build your base from there. The other thing I think is how your go-to-market strategy needs to be intrinsic to your product. So when you're building your product, you can't make the launch of that product an afterthought. So figure out ways you can build the growth, the sharing, and the benefit into the actual product rather than sort of showing up once your product's ready and going, okay, how do we sell this thing? There have been a few times where I've been talking to a founder either via Zoom or in a room, and they just go, can you hang on a sec? And they grab a paper or a whiteboard and they start writing things down. You have this moment. We did a session for Just Evil Enough a few weeks ago, and one of the participants messaged me on LinkedIn afterwards, and she said, I just have this question. And I replied to her. Halfway through, she goes, wow, this is amazing. We're going to hold a meeting about this, and I'll let you know how it goes. Do you want to join? Like that moment where you feel like you've unlocked something. I think it's super important for mentors to realize we are always not at the coalface. We don't understand how difficult the job of the founder is. And so the best thing we can do is throw ideas in that they can contextualize for their business. Once you remember that, you realize that things that seem simple to you are difficult for that founder to accomplish. But when you've given them something that unlocks like a stumbling point, often by bringing in an idea from another domain or vertical or business model, that feels amazing. So I think there's this thing in the Valley called the 5-minute favor. And so these kind of reciprocal 5-minute favors really help speed up the cycle time and the pace of innovation. That's one of the reasons it's great to be a mentor, is that you are able to lubricate the speed at which innovation happens. And I think human society needs a lot of innovation. The second thing is I've had the great fortune to have people who gave me time when I was just some guy trying to figure things out, that made a huge amount of difference. So not wasting other people's time because you've seen things. And then it's also a great way just to stay on top of what's happening in technology. I can't tell you the number of times that mentoring someone has exposed me to something I wasn't aware of that then becomes useful to me in some other veins. So it's staying on top of trends, it's paying it forward, and it's speeding up the pace of innovation as a whole. You have to realize that the startup founder is going through a bunch of stuff you're unaware of. Don't be hurt if they don't like your idea. They will almost certainly nod politely and say thank you, even if it's stupid. So be humble about that. Be transparent. Try very hard to understand the context, and then understand where they are in that startup journey. So if they're early on and they're doing ideation, coming in with a bunch of operationalization stuff about how they should organize their CRM is not going to help. If later on they've got a very specific goal for this quarter, talking about rebuilding the whole company from scratch won't help. So try and contextualize the information you're giving to the stage that they're at. And then really, understand that everything's got to tie back to attention. If they cannot create attention that they can turn into profitable demand, then nothing else matters. They just won't have the oxygen to survive. And so be pragmatic. Recognize that there are some business realities they need to adhere to. And if your advice takes them away from those realities, it may actually be damaging.